Face Forward Media. This is Healthcare Musings. I'm your host, Dr. Hassaballa. Welcome to Healthcare Musings, everybody. Happy to have you with me. So continuing on the series on the new 2026 Sepsis Guidelines, last time we talked about, maybe we can talk about the 17 strong recommendations, because there were a whole bunch of conditional recommendations. There were 19 good practice statements and then 17 strong recommendations with the kind of the strongest evidence. So the adult section of the guidelines had 17 strong recommendations where there was a clear benefit over harm, and it was typically based on moderate to high certainty evidence, and they worded it as we recommend or we recommend against, right? So rather than we suggest, saying they suggest is not random. It means that there's kind of less certainty, maybe less strong of evidence. So there were 17 in the adult part of the guidelines, which is my focus as an adult intensivist. 17 strong gut recommendations. So we'll quickly go over them. So number one, performance improvement programs for hospitals and health systems. They recommend a performance improvement program for sepsis, including sepsis screening for acutely ill high-risk patients, standard operating procedures for treatment, and implementations of sepsis quality improvement strategies in the hospital. So that's the first thing, and that makes sense. If you should have a sepsis team, sometimes they talk about code sepsis or sepsis alert. In my hospital, that I'm part of the sepsis committee, and so that's a strong recommendation. It's the first one. Number two, for acutely ill patients in the hospital, they recommend using NEWS or NEWS2 or MUSE or SIRS over QSOFA, which I thought was interesting. NEWS, these are a whole bunch of early warning systems, even SIRS, which is very nonspecific, but they recommended that over QSOFA, which is the quick SOFA, which is three things in the old SOFA guidelines that you can maybe use to screen for sepsis. So that was very interesting. Number three, for adults with possible, probable, or definite sepsis or septic shock, we recommend collecting blood cultures as soon as possible, and ideally before the administration of antimicrobial therapy. There's low certainty evidence, but this makes sense. Like if they are bacteremic, you want to get it. You want to get the bacteria before they do broad spectrum antibiotics, because you want to know what you're treating. Now, a lot of times we don't get anything in the blood, and still, if you're gonna get bacteremia, it's best to do it before antibiotics, but you got to do it as soon as possible. And this is where a lot of hospitals fall out of the SEP1 bundle, is that they don't get blood cultures document. Either they don't get them before antibiotics, or they don't document that they got them before antibiotics, and so they fall out of the SEP1 bundle. So, I mean, that makes sense. If you're going to be bacteremic, and you're going to catch it, you should do it before antimicrobial therapy. Broad spectrum antimicrobial therapy is instituted. The other thing is, the best time to get blood cultures, by the way, is when they're rigoring, when they're shaking, not when they're febrile. A lot of people get blood cultures when they're febrile. That's not the best time. You are actually bacteremic or viremic, typically, when you are rigoring. That's when the IL-1 is coming out, and that's when you're developing the heat to generate a fever. So the best time, and I learned that when I was an intern, the best time to get a positive blood culture is when they're having rigors, not when they're febrile. Now, antibiotic timing. For adults with possible, probable, or definite septic shock, we recommend administering antimicrobial therapy immediately, ideally within 1 hour of recognition. This has very low certainty of evidence, but that just, again, makes sense. The sooner you get antibiotics, the better. So how about those with sepsis but without shock? So they say for adults with probable or definite sepsis without shock, we recommend administering antimicrobial therapy immediately, ideally within 1 hour. That makes sense. Again, get the blood cultures right before you start antibiotics and do them ASAP as soon as possible. The next, prolonged beta-lactam infusion. For adults with sepsis or septic shock, we recommend using prolonged infusion of beta-lactams for maintenance over bolus administration. So 4-hour beta-lactam, either piperacillin tazobactam or other beta-lactams, which I thought was interesting. Antimicrobial de-escalations. For adults with sepsis or septic shock, we recommend de-escalation of antimicrobial therapy over no de-escalation when a confirmed microbiological diagnosis and susceptibility profile is available. again, they said there's very low certainty evidence, but this just makes total sense, right? If you know you're dealing with an E. coli that's sensitive to ceftriaxone, there makes no sense for you to use cefepime, or makes no sense for you to use piperacillin and tazobactam. If you know it's susceptible, even if it's susceptible to sulfamethoxazole, and trimethoprim, Bactrim, you should use the narrowest therapy so that you don't develop antibacterial resistance. That just makes sense. So we talked about this last time. Or a MAP target. This is a strong recommendation. For adults with septic shock, we recommend an initial mean arterial pressure target of 65 millimeters over higher MAP targets, meaning 65 versus 70 or 75. Okay. And then remember, last time we talked about older patients, we can target a lower MAP. Lower MAP target means 60 to 65 for adults who are older than 65, which I thought was interesting. This is the next strong recommendation. For adults with sepsis or septic shock, we recommend using crystalloids as first-line fluid resuscitation. Crystalloids, as opposed to colloids or starches or anything like that. In fact, the next recommendation, they recommend against using hetastarch or hexamethyl starch, against using starches. There's actually bad evidence. Norepinephrine. For adults with septic shock, we recommend using norepinephrine as the first-line agent over dopamine, epinephrine, or celepressin. Okay? And this is high certainty evidence for norepinephrine versus their alternatives. So norepinephrine should be your first choice. Then there's other stuff. If you have sepsis and ARDS, for adults with sepsis and ARDS, we recommend using a low tidal volume ventilation strategy, 6 ml per kilo, over a high tidal volume, more than 10 ml per kilo. I think that's pretty established. For adults with sepsis and ARDS, we recommend using an upper limited goal of plateau pressure of 30 over higher. Okay, because if you have higher, that can lead to barotrauma and further lung injury. They recommend against incremental PEEP titration. For adults with sepsis and moderate to severe ARDS, we recommend against using an incremental PEEP titration strategy. And then there's other supportive therapies. For adults with sepsis or septic shock, we recommend using a restrictive transfusion therapy strategy over a liberal transfusion strategy, meaning for me, that means keeping hemoglobin, not transfusing unless the hemoglobin goes below 7. Okay. Glycemic control. For adults with sepsis or septic shock, we recommend initiating insulin therapy at a glucose level of 180 or greater. For me, that means a continuous infusion insulin. Maybe you can get away with frequent subcutaneous, but good glycemic control, because the higher the glucose, the worse the outcomes. And then VTE prophylaxis. For adults with sepsis or septic shock, we recommend using pharmacologic VTE prophylaxis unless a contraindication exists, and they recommend using low molecular weight heparin over unfractionated heparin, so enoxaparin or fondaparinux or the like. So these are the strong recommendations from the guidelines. Nothing earth-shattering. It just makes sense. Start your antibiotics as soon as possible. Get blood cultures before. De-escalate as soon as you know what the bug is. Prolonged infusions, and then talk about ARDS therapy. Targeting a mean of 65. That's definitely going to be, especially for younger patients. That's going to be, I was kind of hesitating about that, but the guidelines reiterate that. Using crystalloids rather than colloids or starches, and starting with norepinephrine. So nothing earth-shattering, but those are the strong recommendations. Nothing about Dr. Hassaballa, unfortunately. But you know what? Even if it's a conditional recommendation, I'll take it. Anyway, guys, thanks so much for your time and attention, and I'll see you next time on Healthcare Musings. Thank you for listening. Sign up at healthcaremusings.com to get every episode delivered directly to your email. And please don't forget to leave a 5-star review. Thank you so much.